So I thought of another example of a context-dependent phenomena, and there is out right now, posted on Instagram, a picture of this little beautiful moth that is in its adult stage feeding and probably getting ready to build some webs and pupate, maybe over the winter. Not quite sure about that part of its life cycle. Anyway, little guy is really cute. It's super thin, maybe a third of the width of my fingernail, half to a third of the width of my fingernail, and slightly longer, maybe just a tad bit longer. And get this, in October it is colored orange, black, and white. How perfect is that? So I often see them, and you might see them, on goldenrod flowers, hanging around. So these are moths, Ailanthus moths, I think that's a common name. And when they're resting, just sitting there resting, doing their thing, being all pretty on the goldenrod, they look sort of like an elongated beetle, because their wings are just so spectacular. They don't look like wings, they look more like a beetle shell. But then when they fly, when you see them take off and fly, their wings move so fast, you don't see that color anymore, and they look more like a wasp, just really a small wasp. So they're kind of crazy. And they are actually known to be a tropical species. So what are they doing as far north as Maryland or Knoxville, Tennessee? Turns out that their distribution, or the range across the continent that they can live comfortably, or the globe, I should say, multiple continents, that they can live comfortably, is context dependent. And that context is climate. So as the climate warms, we're seeing lots of things move north, which may seem like a good thing, but I can explain why that might be a bad thing. So these guys that were originally pretty much just limited to the tropics, we now see them in northern habitats that have become warmer year-round and definitely have much warmer winters with reduced freezing temperatures or reduced number of days of freezing temperatures. An example of this is the Ailanthus moth. And just so you know, when it's called a web moth also, and for a lot of gardeners, a web moth is like a horrible thing, right? It means it's going to spin a massive web and eat tons of your leaves and really slow the developmental and growth processes of the tree on which it's feeding. Well, these guys don't do that. They make a teeny tiny little web that maybe takes 3 or 4 leaves that they use to sort of wrap around themselves and build this web, and it's basically just there to protect their little pupa, which is hanging down from one of the leaves or hidden in one of the leaves, while they metamorphose into a different type of organism, right? Caterpillar to moth. Very cool. So they don't do a lot of damage. And they actually, it looks like there's some evidence that them hanging out on those goldenrods and then moving along to another goldenrod, they're indirectly pollinating. So they're a pollinating moth. Okay, not quite as actively engaged in that whole process as we think of when we think of pollinating bees. Alright, so that's context dependent. So what about this bit about moving northward? Okay, so climate change happens. Species are just going to march across the planet and move to some place that they can handle, and we keep our biodiversity and everything's copacetic. No. So we've already lost a ton of biodiversity and a ton of species numbers. So abundance just means the total number. Biodiversity means the different kinds. So everybody knows this is the fastest extinction rate on record since this planet has hosted, well, maybe there was there's a lot more species to lose. So since this planet hosted living things. So As far as we know, this is the fastest extinction event on record, which is really heartbreaking if you love nature. Like I love nature, and if you're listening to this, you must have some love of nature. Alright, so maple trees also moving northward. This has allowed some people in states that didn't previously harvest for sugar maple or maple syrup are now able to harvest for that maple syrup. But what's also happening are the trees are being exposed to pathogens, novel pathogens, that they haven't experienced before. And so, yeah, they might make it farther north, and then they proceed to die there or barely survive because they encounter a pathogen, whether it's a bacteria or a fungus that they never experienced before, and they don't have an immune system that's strong enough to deal with that new pathogen. Also, with climate change comes not just an average change in temperatures. The most harm, one might argue, that's coming as a result of the climate crisis is the fact that we have a lot more extreme events. And extreme events are harder for human survival, and they're harder for the survival of any other living organism. So we have more extreme rainfall, which means more extreme flooding, or 100-year flooding events become 10-year flooding events. We have more extreme hurricanes that are warmer and slower and mean more higher rainfall or more extreme rainfall events. We have more extreme fire events. So we have not only a higher frequency of fires, but those fires burn hotter, and because they burn hotter, they're more difficult to control. So all of these things lead to massive losses in resources. Remember we talked about those resources like home, food, habitat to find a mate, habitat to rear your young. Just think about the Australian forests. So those burned. Yes, lots of koala bears and other very important mammals and creatures, snakes, amphibians were saved, but they have no habitat. How long does it take for those forests to recover? And since the fire events are going to be happening with more frequency, do some of those places ever recover? So they've not only lost, say, brothers and sisters and relatives, if you're a koala or a snake, but you've also lost your food, your habitat in terms of where you lived, where you protected yourself, where you hunted, where you made and reared babies.